Welcome everyone to our last panel on the last day. Thank you for your patience and all your contributions. All the accolades goes to you, even though we have been as organizers receiving a lot of thanks. All the thanks to the people in the room. Thank you so much. So we will have this last roundtable on the potential solutions to the themes that we have been talking since 3 days on polarization with different terms and terminology. And we hope this roundtable will be just the beginning of another conversation that will unfold in the virtual panel series and also your new formed relationships among yourselves as scholars to collaborate on future publications. We are honored to work with you all. It has been a privilege to serve and to connect this enthusiastic community. And without further ado, the floor is yours, Serena.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simi. Warm welcome also from me. My name is Irina van Wiese. I am the honorary president of the ECPS. I'm sorry I haven't been able to join you any earlier, but it is a true honor and privilege to be here today and part of such a very distinguished panel. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Selçuk, who's going to introduce the panel to you.
Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the third round table, which is the last piece of our program. I hope you still have some energy for our round table. The title of round table is When the Social Contract is Broken, How to Put the Genie Back. The topic is inspired by Professor Eric Beinhocker's research published in The Nature and Dynamics of Collaboration, MIT Press. Beinhocker is a professor of public policy practice at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. He is also the founder and executive director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the university's Oxford Martin School. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today due to the change of his program, so the task of summarizing his research has fallen on me. I'm a poor messenger. Hence, what I am going to talk about is not a presentation as such, it's an introduction to Beinhocker's research. Its aim is to create a framework for our discussion that will follow, focusing on possible solutions. Entitled Fair Social Contracts and the Foundations of Large-Scale Collaboration, the basic takeaways from his research are as follows. Over the past decades, the United States and similar other countries have witnessed a breakdown in political collaboration, increased polarization, a loss of faith in democracy, a loss of trust in key institutions, and the rise of populist and authoritarian political figures. The United States and other similarly affected countries cannot heal political divisions, renew faith in democracy, fight against populism, and reinvigorate collaboration at a national scale unless the social contract is restored. If individuals perceive a social contract to be fair, then they are more likely to engage in high-functioning collaborative behaviors. In contrast, if individuals perceive the arrangements to be unfair, then they are more likely to withdraw their collaboration or engage in destructive behaviors. In this sense, the perceived fairness or unfairness of social contracts is foundational to establishing and maintaining large-scale collaborations. Drawing on a large body of behavioral research, Beinhocker identifies 9 key dimensions of social contract fairness and uses his theory to explain the breakdown in political collaboration in the United States and similar countries. The 9 dimensions of social contract fairness are agency, inclusion, dignity, rule-based, meritocratic, security, capabilities, reciprocity, and progress. He divides 9 dimensions into 3 groups, namely relational fairness, procedural fairness, and distributional fairness. Beinhocker argues that for large segments of the US population, all 9 dimensions of social contract fairness were broken during the mid-70s to 2010s, setting off the current wave of political populism. The 9 dimensions of social contract fairness are closely related to moral preferences, and Beinhocker proposed that they are likewise highly universal and applicable across cultures. But individuals and cultures will vary in how they are interpreted, weighted, and traded off in specific social contracts. A shift toward more so-called neoliberal economic policies, both in right-wing Reagan and Thatcher and left-wing Clinton and Blair governments, resulted in shifting the tax burden away from the wealthiest individuals and corporations to middle and lower income workers, relative reductions in public investment, weakening of the social safety net, changes to labor market regulations that reduced union and worker power, central bank policies that prioritized low inflation over employment and wage growth, trade policies that favored corporate over worker interests. Perceptions and misperceptions of contract violation have contributed to increases in racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, misogyny, and anti-elite backlash. A key aspect of the psychology of broken contracts is that feelings of contract violation must first be acknowledged and empathized with before people are willing to listen and engage in contract reconstruction. Populist candidates have succeeded electorally by giving voice to resultant feelings of moral outrage, promising to fix the violation, and contrasting themselves with out-of-touch elites who don't get it. It is essential that political and other leaders who genuinely want to restore the social contract acknowledge first and foremost that the social contract has been broken. Populist politicians exploit the broken contract anger. They stoke feelings of tribalism and dangerously create others as the violators who deserve that anger. Foreigners, other racial, ethnic, or religious groups, immigrants, other regions, opposing political parties, and elites. While the most high-profile populist politicians have tended to be on the political right, Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban, Erdogan, these feelings of broken contract anger cross the political spectrum. The challenge is immense. Reform on any of the issues that today trigger broken contract outrage, immigration reform, limiting corporate power, welfare reform, tax reform, trade reform, or improving economic security and opportunity for working families would be a heavy lift in the best of political circumstances, and we are not in those circumstances. The specific issues and challenges differ by country, but a common theme is this widespread perception of broken political systems. So political reform, limiting the power of special interests, rooting out corruption, showing that governments can be competent and get things done, and making systems more responsive to what voters actually want, must be at the heart of any changes aimed at social contract repair. When the social contract is broken, it's very hard to put the moral outrage genie back in the bottle. But history shows it's possible. Late 19th century America saw bloody labor strife, historic levels of inequality, bitter divisions following the Civil War, stresses from immigration, political scandals, corruption, a series of devastating financial panics, and the rise of fire-breathing populists like William Jennings Bryan. Yet, that period was followed by one of the country's most consequential eras of reform, most famously led by Teddy Roosevelt, but made possible by the courage, actions, and leadership of countless reformers in politics, business, and civil society. We need that kind of leadership again today. So we have three distinguished speakers and discussants at our roundtable today. Because Professor Eric Beinhocker is going to leave, I'm going to give first the floor to him. Please.
Thank you. Indeed, apologies. I will just have to leave it 5 minutes to 4 to get to Heathrow in time. So first, I'll just do a contrarian response to the paper, even though the author is not here, and then I will throw a few ideas of my own. Can a breakdown of a social contract or a concept of a social contract explain the rise of populism? Well, social contract theory was instrumentally important in the history of the English-speaking people. It started as a revolt of the English for their ancient rights that led to the Puritan Revolution and so on. The American founders took that as well. Is there a tradition of social contract theory in Hungary? The legitimacy was of the emperor because by the grace of the Catholic Church and the tradition. And then there was a nationalist leader, Admiral Horthy, who was had some kind of legitimacy, this concept of a sovereign who represents the nation. And then there was communism. And the legitimacy came from the future. Is there a concept of social contract in Turkey? Well, there was a sultan, was a caliph, but his legitimacy was from religion. Then Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, as a leader of a national movement against sovereignty, represented that. I don't see a tradition of social contract outside, that is politically relevant outside of academia, outside the English-speaking people. Even worse so, there's this kind of nostalgia to, let's say, 1970, that somehow everything was fine then, and then there was a breakdown of that with Reagan and Thatcher, and therefore now, 30 years later, there's a revolt against that. Okay, what was in 1970? The Vietnam War, social contract, social harmony, Jim Crow in the South, racism, sexism, no immigration. Turkey, generals. Hungary, communism, totalitarianism. What are we nostalgic for exactly here? It was horrible. And I'm not even starting to talk about patriarchy, LGBT rights, and so on and so forth. Is that the harmony that we are looking for? Maybe in some village in England, but outside of that, heck, I'd rather take the populist word of today than the word of 1970. Then the neoliberal whipping boy. When all is said and done, when we write global history of the 21st century, what is going to be the story? Yes, it will be a short chapter on populism. Of course, we don't know how it's going to end. But what's the story of the 21st century? What happened? 2 billion people escaped poverty in Asia. We are living now in the most equal, economically equal world since the mid-18th century, since before the Industrial Revolution. And at that time, equality was because everybody was poor. Those 2 million Asians who got out of poverty, I mean, that's perhaps the most astounding event in world history from the perspective of the common people. Nothing like that happened before or after. Now, we in the West felt it a little bit as prices went down and some jobs were lost. But from a global perspective, those 2 billion people, that is the story. And I don't see anything to protest against. I think it's the most wonderful thing that happened in world history. And I'm looking forward to it. And of course, the problem now is that we expected from the perspective of development theory in political sciences that will result in democratization in China. And China just became more powerful. It didn't become more democratic, it became less democratic. Otherwise, what goes on in China, I think, is anybody's guess. I do a lot of work in China. And I have one trick question that I always ask to my Chinese interlocutors, who are usually academics. Which of Kafka's novels is your favorite? I always get an answer. Something is happening there under the ice. There is a shift. How it will resolve itself, I don't know. But they read Kafka. And that means for me that they belong to my civilization. And I'm happy for them. There are other people in China, but that says quite a lot. My wife, who grew up in communist Prague, told me that how she would get to date the desirable boys is that she had a copy of Kafka to lend them. Everybody wanted to get a copy of Kafka. And that test, the Chinese passed it. Finally, 19th century, the resolution, what happened at the end of 19th century that gave America this harmony? Jim Crow, the disenfranchisement of blacks in the South. Is that something that we celebrate? And then 1924, they stopped migration. Became, which of course, in due course, caused the Holocaust, because the Jews had nowhere to run. Is that, again, something that we celebrate? I mean, it started only in the 1970s, Ted Kennedy, and there was liberalization of immigration, which gave us somewhat more interesting United States. So I'm sorry, but that's, you know, not much there, I'm afraid, for me. What do I think? If you want, how to resolve this now, how we try to resolve it? Well, first, I think there are 3 reasons for the rise of populism. There may be more. I may be exaggerating. you can correct me. Obviously, it started with a recession of 2008. I think the recession was misinterpreted as an evolutionary extinction event by some of the people who underwent it. It triggered all sorts of atavistic mechanisms that are quite useful when there was not enough food and you were a member of the tribe, so you kill the weak and attack the other tribe. And somehow we have this mechanism. And when we misinterpret what is just an economic recession under condition with welfare states, so nobody's going to really go hungry. People lost home, but they did not become homeless because of this. It triggered something very bad. Secondly, one of the reactions of what I called earlier the populist elites, that is, elites that are self-destructive, was to block social mobility. To create not a glass ceiling, but a glass floor for themselves. To make it just much more difficult for people from the middle class to take their place, because when the pie became stable, the pie became closed, if people from the middle class got more, it would be at the expense of people who are above them. And they use a number of mechanisms, for example, the universities, to pretty much block mobility. Especially visible in the United States, these things didn't happen before in the United States. There we can be nostalgic, but not to the world of the 1970s, but to the world before 2008. Well, eventually you can always go to California and experience mobility in your own lifetime. That was blocked, that stopped. And the weakening of liberal institutions. How do we handle that? So I have few speculations, not much more than that. How do we stop people from feeling when they're undergoing economic recession that it's an extinction event for them? First, well, education, teach them about economic recessions, teach them how they start, how they end, what's going on, education. Universal basic income, that is, everybody gets the same salary irrespective of what happens to them. That there's always a ground below which you can't fall. To create a sense of some kind of security. What they used to call in the old days sentimental education, how to deal with your passion, how to deal with your fears. These are things that we don't teach in school. And Santayana famously said, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. The problem is that nobody studies history anymore, or they study history in such a synthetic way that the glories of the nation or the glories of or the glories of progress. I mean, my daughter studies in Massachusetts. It's all history of progress. They don't prepare them for when history goes wrong. And Santayana, interestingly enough, and people don't read him anymore, but it's an interesting text. He has an Aristotelian concept of historical virtue. That is, obviously, if you don't learn from the past, you're in internal childhood. You need to repeat every mistake again and again and again because you don't remember. But also, the opposite vice is to live in a trauma. That is what I call the reduction to Adolf. Any temple dictator is Hitler again. You live in a trauma. You don't have the sensitivity to the historical time that you live. And that's a lot of it. It's about training, about learning how to learn from history. How to unclog mobility bottlenecks. Housing. People in the cities are less populist usually than people in the countryside, so we need to facilitate moving to the cities. If it's overregulated, the housing is too expensive, it's a very well-known problem, people are not going to move. We need to get them to move, so we need to deregulate the cities. Education. Institutions of higher education need to start behaving like businesses, in the sense that if Oxford and Harvard have the brand name, why not run them like Starbucks? Open Oxford and Harvard in every city. Franchise. Get a lot of people. I mean, how many people who graduate from Oxford and Harvard end up being populist? Not too many, because they get good education. Why not spread it around? Why not have the effects of scale? Why not go online as well? But basically, it's all about acting in an economically rational way. Sell education and research, don't sell exclusion. That's self-destructive. The more exclusive you become, the more self-destructive you become, because you create resentment against you by the people who don't go through the sieve And that's, again, a process that now Trump is using in the United States to go against the universities. Don't fight against social media, fight against the algorithms that cater to the passions, that inflame the passions. Social media is good, it connects the world, but the problem is the algorithm, is what they make you watch that usually upsets you, and that's why you stay there and you react. I never react, I just scroll on. But, that's another kind of idea, and I think I'll stop there. You got the idea.
Thank you very much, Professor Tucker, and we wish you a happy and safe trip back. Our second speaker is Lord John Thomas Alderdice, who is a member of the House of Lords. He is the founding director of the Conference on the Resolution of Intractable Conflict at Oxford University and the founder of the Center for Democracy and Peace Building. Please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind invitation. Good to be with you here. I spend a fair bit of my time in Oxford and live not very far away, so it's no great distance for me to come. It's always a pleasure to do things here in Oxford. Although I have to say, this is one of the few colleges that I haven't been in. In Blackfriars, lots of times, but here not so much, and it's really nice. I've enjoyed it already. My background and my interest in all of this comes from growing up in a situation where there was great division, violence, and political conflict over many centuries, Northern Ireland, or Ireland, because of course Northern Ireland only existed during the 20th century. And when I was coming into my teens, I became quite preoccupied because the violence was breaking out again. It went through these cycles, relatively peaceful trouble, peaceful trouble. And I began to think, well, what is it that's going on here? And I started to read some political science in my early teens. And after a short while, I thought to myself, you know, this is all very interesting, but it's actually nonsense, because it was based on the notion that people are rational actors operating in their best socioeconomic and power interests. And it was clear to me that people were not operating on a rational basis at all, and nobody was getting any better. It was just getting into a completely horrible mess. So I thought to myself, well, are there people who spend their life trying to understand why individual people behave in ways that are non-rational and self-destructive? And I thought, well, that's what psychiatrists do. So I went into medicine and then psychiatry and psychoanalysis with the idea that if I could understand why individual people did these self-destructive things, maybe I could understand why a community did it, and then, importantly, do something about it. Because one of the things about being a doctor is you're not interested in only the diagnosis. You're not even interested only in the pathology. I mean, pathology is very interesting. My wife was a pathologist for many years, and she was able to speak in great detail about particular disease entities. But that of itself doesn't heal people. Indeed, in psychiatry, there's not much point in somebody coming along, speaking with you, and you say, I know what your problem is. Read this book. Chapter 4 will describe your problem absolutely. And if you say that to a patient, they'll say, this guy's nuts. You know? Because reading about it doesn't solve the problem. And that's one of the difficulties about an academic approach to these difficulties, is that rationality may give you an understanding of the roots of the problem, but they don't necessarily bring you to a practical solution. How do you deal with it and address it? And I was living in a community where I wanted not just to understand it, but to try to find a way of making it different. So I began to understand, I thought, a little bit about it. And I went into politics. I became the leader of one of the political parties and started to try to apply the sorts of things I'd understood. And one of the things which was very much the kind of received wisdom of the time was that people who were on the extremes, people who were involved in politically motivated violence, you couldn't really engage in a negotiation with them. First of all, because they were committed to making change through violence. And secondly, there was a moral question. There was a problem of moral jeopardy of involving yourself with these people and so on. And so I accepted the view of the time. It seemed perfectly reasonable that if you couldn't deal with that, you could deal with the more reasonable, moderate people on both sides, Unionist, Nationalist, Protestant, Catholic, get some kind of accommodation and marginalize the extremists and settle things down, which is all very reasonable. There's only one problem about it. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work because the people on the extremes can always do something to literally blow it apart. So that set me back. And in particular, I find myself with the 3 other leaders of political parties at that time who were not directly involved in violence, the leaders of the 2 unionist parties and John Hume of the SDLP. I was leading the Alliance Party at that stage. And John came in one day, John Hume came in one day, and he said, well, we're not getting anywhere. We were just meeting, the 4 of us. We often did that away from the 2 governments and our advisors and so on. He said, we're not getting anywhere. I'm going to have to go and talk to the Republicans. That was the IRA and Sinn Féin. And I remember the Ulster Unionist leader, a little man called Jim Molyneux, and his face just went completely white like that tablecloth. He says, well, that's it. There's no hope. No hope. He wasn't angry. He was just really saying, if you do that, first of all, I'm not sure we can continue to talk to you because our people won't accept it. And secondly, because there isn't anything that you can negotiate with them that we can live with. We've been at war for hundreds of years. So I went home that night and I felt quite down about all of this. And I thought, what are we going to do? And I knew John very well by this stage. And I knew that if John had decided something, well, he was going to continue to do it. So although I could be critical of him, I felt we have to test his idea to destruction. And that led us down a road, which ultimately led to involving us in negotiations with Sinn Féin, the IRA, the Royalist paramilitaries on the other side, of course, the British and Irish governments. And we got an agreement in 1998 and set up a new assembly at that stage. But the key understanding that emerged from it was that fundamentally our problem was not one of institutions or constitutions or policing and the administration of justice or socioeconomic diversity or whatever. It was not, those were not the causes. Those were symptoms. What were the symptoms of? They were symptoms of disturbed historic relationships between communities. It was fundamentally about relationships. And one of the things that became clear, not just there, but when I started going to areas of conflict in other parts of the world, was that how people felt about things was the powerful driver. It wasn't how they thought about things. You know, if I said to a bunch of people here, particularly in a place like Blackfriars and St. Cross, would you like to go to heaven? You know, probably a number of people would say, well, yes. I say, would you like to go this afternoon? They say, I'm not in a big rush. You can believe all sorts of things and it doesn't necessarily make you want to put your life in jeopardy or to risk the well-being of your family and friends. But when you feel something powerful, that can drive you to do something, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. So what were the key feeling drivers? Well, there are essentially 2 feeling drivers plus 1 context. The first thing that struck me enormously in engaging with people, particularly those who had involved themselves in paramilitary violence, but not just them, and that was that when people feel humiliated and disrespected, it is a powerfully poisonous emotion with individuals and with communities. You know, we can argue and disagree and ask each other questions and so on, and then go and have a drink. But if you ask me something and I humiliate you publicly in front of a whole bunch of other people, you will never forget that. You may forget what I said, you may forget what had happened, but if you hear my name in 10 years' time or you bump into me in 15 years' time, you will remember how I made you feel. You may not remember the rest, but you'll remember that. Why? Because it made you feel really horrible, really bad, often really angry, but certainly makes you feel really bad. And in political life, one of the things that's very striking, every situation I went to, without exception, where there was intractable, violent political problems, there was at least one community, and often more than one community, that felt humiliated and disrespected. The second thing that I found was the one that you mentioned, and that is the one that you mentioned, and that is unfairness. But this was a curious one. It was always there. It's there with individuals, it's there with communities. You know, when my sons, who are now up and married and have their own kids and so on, but when they were little boys, you know, one of them would take the other fellow's toys or car or something like that. And the one who was offended against would come and he would say, Daddy, it's not fair. He didn't say it's not just. He didn't say Stephen's broken the rules. He said that. He said it's not fair. And it came from in here much more than up here. It's a very powerful feeling, the sense of unfairness. But you have to be a little careful about it when it comes to politics. For example, If you look at the situation for two groups of people, one of which is better off economically and socially than the other, you would assume that because there is that difference between them, that there will be powerful feelings of unfairness. It's not necessarily the case. If, for example, that community looks at it and they say, well, you know, they're much better off than us, but they're also better educated than we are. Maybe if we were better educated, you know, we would be better off, but we're not. Say so. If you then come in and say, so the solution is we put in better education. And don't forget, the best educated country in the world in the 1930s was Germany. So you have to be a little careful about what education does. But if you say, let's put in education, and the young people do extremely well, and they get to a point, and then they still can't get the jobs. They're actually more angry than before they were given the education, because they say there is now no justification for it. And then they're really, really angry. And if you look in Northern Ireland, for example, when did things break down? They broke down in the 1960s. They broke down in the 1960s for a whole bunch of reasons. You worked there for a while. They broke down for a number of reasons. Everywhere in the world, there was talk about human rights. There were protest marches in France, in Germany, in Japan, the United States. And in each situation, it took the coloring of the particular society. And in Northern Ireland, that was important. But there was another thing in Northern Ireland, and it was this. In that period of time, before the 1960s, the government, not a very good government, not a very fair government, but one of the things they decided to do, when the Catholic Church insisted that their children could not go to the state schools because they wanted to manage them, and they took them out of the state schools, and therefore they had not the money for education for all these kids, eventually the state said it is not right to discriminate against these kids. And therefore, by the 1960s and into the 1970s, Catholic schools, completely run by the Catholic Church, had 100% capital and revenue paid by the public purse. Right? So a whole raft of young people in the Catholic community were able to get through the whole of school and go to university. And in those distant days, which none of you will remember, but I remember, and you will remember, you got your fees paid and you even got a student grant. So these young people were able to come. It didn't matter whether they had a background that was socially able to bring them to, you know, they were able to go. If they had the ability to go, they could go. And so a whole raft of these young people came through. And it was that generation of people like Seamus Mallon and John Hume and Austin Curry and so on, who got through to the end of tertiary level education and then found that they still couldn't get the jobs. And Irish people have a bit of a sense of humor. So, you know, there's a story about these two little boys that were going down the Falls Road, which is a Catholic area, and they were singing, "The prods have all the houses, the prods get all the houses." And the priest stopped them and said, "No, that's not very nice. No, you should sing something nicer than that." So, you know, it's coming up to Christmas time. Why didn't you sing, you know, Jesus was born in a manger? Okay. So they started singing, Jesus was born in a manger, Jesus was born in a manger. And the priest said, "Oh, that's much better. That's much better." No, why was Jesus born in a manger? Because the prods of all the houses, prods of all. So in Northern Ireland, the humor tends to come through in order to help us to live with all the problems and difficulties of our history and background and the sense of hopelessness that things can't change. And that's made worse by the third thing that I would observe. The first was humiliation and disrespect. The second was a sense of unfairness. And the third is we've tried democratically and it doesn't work. And then you get the breakout. You've got the situation where it's a tinderbox, and that's what happened. But to take it the other direction is in a way, at least mentally, simple. You start treating people respectfully rather than disrespectfully. You make sure that things are done fairly rather than unfairly. And you ensure that even those who've been involved in political violence have got a route into the democratic process. A democratic process which is not a majoritarian one, but one in which people of very different backgrounds and very different sets of beliefs can be part of it. A political process essentially based from a philosophical point of view on Isaiah Berlin's value pluralism. And that's the kind of situation that we constructed eventually out of the Good Friday Agreement and so on and so on. Of course, to actually do these things means building relationships. If the problem was disturbed historic relationships, the resolution is to find a way of building better relationships. And I could tell you lots of stories about that, because you have to do it at all levels. It has to be at the level of leadership, but it also has to be at the level of, if you like, societal middle management, as well as the community as a whole. And the other final thing I'd say about relationships is this: they're never sorted, right? If you've got a relationship and you think it's sorted, it's already in trouble because you think it's sorted. Relationships are something that you always have to work on and develop and be conscious of and repair, and it's something organic. And so whenever people say that such and such is not sorted, say, well, of course not. Relationships don't get sorted in that way. They get to a better place, a place where you can have some confidence that the person will treat you respectfully, treat you fairly, understand and make you part of the process. And sometimes people feel that's very unsatisfactory because they want to get it sorted and they want to understand it and say, tick that box, that's it, done. But it just doesn't work like that. I shall leave it there.
Thank you very much. And last but not the least is Professor Julian Müller. He is the Professor of Political Philosophy at University of Graz. His main areas of research are political philosophy and applied ethics. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I fear I cannot be as entertaining as the previous two speakers, but I will try my very best. So as a philosopher, the main thing that I'm really interested about is getting like transparency into our concepts. And one of the main themes, obviously, of this conference was populism and how we should think about populism. And just as a reminder, right? So we heard that a lot of populists, are overtly racist. They affirm whiteness. They affirm various, toxic ideals of masculinity. We heard that they are irrational in various ways, right? Just to give one example, right? They are anti-Islam, but they like to eat kebab. We heard that they are consumed by passion, right? In the last talk. So just to remind you, this idea that perhaps it's fun to go to a rally, it's fun to be to play on Twitter, use all of these, like at least once in your life, let your passions reign, even if that's just on Twitter. So what's interesting to me is that, we use this term populism, and then we collected all of these very, very negative properties and all pulled them under this label of populism, right? And I'm always wondering whether this is such a good idea and whether we should not differentiate a little bit more, right? Because we also heard that there's real grievances, right? So on a macro level, for the past 20 years, there's been no increases in income. On a micro level, we know that in many big cities, teachers have a particularly bad time for the past 10 years. One of my students, for instance, she's a teacher at Hamburg, one of the most beautiful cities in Germany. And she says, well, I have 16 students, I have 20 students from 16 different nations. I would like to teach math, I would like to teach philosophy, but I cannot because people just don't speak German. So I need to teach them German. So we can never get to this place where we teach mathematics or where we teach philosophy. And there's another set of grievances, right? So a lot of people are just conservatives, yeah, and these people, if we look at polls, we see that they feel more and more on the back foot, and they think about how their life world changes and whether they have a future. And if we now look at these kind of people who have these very real grievances in terms of income, in terms of having a difficult time to teach math and philosophy, or people living on the countryside who have certain expectations about how life goes, how life progresses. And they see that in the future, the way their parents have lived, their grandparents have lived, that they will not be able to live like that. Maybe because of economic disruptions, maybe because villages get smaller and smaller and they need to move to the city. All of these are real grievances. But what do they, and then I would like to come to a point that John made, right? So we never forget if we are humiliated. But what did we do in this conference, right? We had this concept of populism, and we put all of these very, very bad properties under this notion of populist. Yeah, we said they are racist, they are irrational, they are consumed by passions. And that's not only how we speak as academics when we are in conferences, but that's also how we write our newspapers. But how will 50% of the people who have these real grievances, how will they feel if they hear how we talk about them? Will they not feel humiliated? And of course they will feel humiliated. Yeah? So that's why I think, coming from a philosophical point of view, it's really important that we get our concepts right, that we distinguish between a racist, between a populist, and between a conservative. And I think one of the main points that I made in my previous presentation is to say, we cannot cooperate with pure racists. We cannot cooperate with people who don't want to reason with us. And I think one of the core features of a real populist, and I think most people are not real populists, but a core feature of a real populist is that you cannot reason with them. But most people are not pure populists. That we can, to make this point again, we really need to distinguish between a racist, a populist, and a conservative, and perhaps even a neoliberal. With a conservative, you can make contracts, you can think about creating a future. With a neoliberal, you can, again, cooperate, right? And so I think it's really, really important that we get our concepts right, because if we don't get our concepts right, we really run into danger of humiliating half of the population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I pass the floor to Irina to share her remarks.
Thank you very much, Selçuk, and a big thank you to Avi, John, and Julian for really, really interesting discussion. I mean, I have to admit I read Beinhacker's article for the first time this week, and I do see a lot of what he wrote reflected on the doorstep. So maybe a little bit more from a practitioner's, a politician's perspective. I grew up in post-war Germany in the 60s and 70s with quite a sort of visual sign of the scars of the war, because there were still sort of some houses missing in Cologne, one of the most affected cities in Germany, almost entirely destroyed. And so I grew up with a lot of hope, with the attempts to rebuild Germany in a democratic structure, and almost taking it for granted as a certainty that a fascist party would never rise again in Germany. So how wrong could I be? But this certainty and this hope also translated, at least for me personally, into an idea that correlates strongly with Beinhocker's social contract. I did believe in the social contract. I did benefit greatly from what society offered me. Now, we didn't have a lot of money. I grew up in a single-parent family. We didn't have a car. We had a small flat, but we had everything that we needed. And importantly, I had access to free education. I had access to the world, really, through membership in the European Union. And most importantly, I had this hope that things were going to get better from generation to generation, and that this generation in particular, that was mine, was growing up in the knowledge that we needed to do everything in our power to prevent a repeat of history in light of the horrors of the Holocaust and the Second World War. Now, I'm not sure whether this actually changed in the 70s, like Beinhocker says, because obviously it wasn't until 1989 and the reunification a year later of Germany, the collapse of the autocracies in Eastern Europe, that we reached arguably the zenith of, or the end of history, if you want, of democratic development. And we know that things have gone downhill since, at least in terms of democracy. Now, I noticed that Beinhocker actually never correlates the social contracts with democracy. As a matter of fact, he also doesn't seem to think that the social contract, or a functioning social contract, is predicated on a system of democracy. All he says is that it is a system of collaboration that works on the basis of trust. And that this trust is what has broken down. So when did it break down? Well, I'm not sure if it really sort of was the 70s to the 2010s, because really the breakdown that started arguably with the recession in 2008 is something that very much continues today. So today I find myself a local politician in Southeast London. I'm an elected councillor in the beautiful borough of Southwark. Now, Southwark is one of the most unequal places in London, you know it. And therefore, given London is one of the most unequal places in Europe, my borough, and particularly the ward I represent in the north of Southwark, is probably one of the most unequal places in Europe. In terms of income, but also in terms of access to opportunity. It's also one of the most diverse places in Europe, which makes it a wonderful place to be, but it is like a microcosm. And if you find a polarized society anywhere, trust me, you find it on my doorsteps where I go every day. And you have to walk for about 3 minutes, less than that, maybe just 1 minute to get from the multi-millionaire penthouses on the Thames riverfront to some of our most deprived social housing developments, where people are crammed into small, moldy, and really not particularly inhabitable Dickensian dwellings. Now, when you knock on these people's doorsteps, there is exactly every single one of Beinhocker's 9 dimensions represented. And the feeling that you get, quite understandably, you don't need to study psychology to understand this, these people have a mixture between anger and resignation. So the anger says, go away, you politicians are all the same, you're all liars, which is, I think, what we hear, those of us who are politicians, we hear all the time, and developments like the embarrassing things that happen in the UK Parliament, for those of you who watched it over the last few days, don't help in that respect. The resignation results, of course, in a withdrawal from the democratic process and not voting at all. The anger, however, is looking for an outlet, and that outlet comes then in the shape of a populist party. So I'm not sure I agree with you that it is the populists we are talking about when we're talking about those people who are exploited. To me, the populists are the exploiters. The populists are those with an ulterior motivation. that has nothing to do with the grievances, that exploits the grievances in order to reach a goal, and that goal tends to be power. And what they do with the power afterwards, well, that depends. Usually they use it to abolish democracy. But it is, when we talk about the people who you rightly say we should not look down upon and treat with dignity, those are the exploited. And those are the people for whom the social contract indeed is broken. Now, today we are ideally at a point where we're talking about solutions, right? And indeed, Beinhocker and Professor Chucker as well offered a number of potential solutions. And I think we all agree that they have to have something to do with equality, that they have something to do with education, that they have something to do with restoring some sense of security. You mentioned UBI, which is, of course, one potential, that they have something to do with basic standards of living, access to housing, access to education, and potentially with bringing back a sense of agency in terms of decentralizing decision-making power. John and I are liberal Democrats, I should say, just for the sake of completeness here. So we believe very much that bringing back power to local entities such as local councils is one small part in that puzzle, where people maybe get a little bit more of a say. But then again, being a locally elected councillor, I can tell you that there's nothing worse than a consultation which then is being ignored, as unfortunately happens quite a lot. So you ask people, but then there is a second step, which is to actually listen and maybe do what people suggest, even if it's not your original idea. I think something that we didn't mention so much on the panel, but which Beinhocker is feeling quite strongly about, is the link between capitalism and the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of few, and increasingly those few being very large corporations. And this is something that is going to be very interesting, I think, to watch in the context of what's happening in the United States, where Trump, who is arguably representing the marginalized and those without access to power, is now actually contributing to greater rather than lesser concentration of wealth in the hands of few. So that will be very interesting to see where that leads. I think I will finish by just trying to make the point here that populism is a means to an end, and that it is yet to be seen where that end leads. In contrast to my own upbringing, my daughter, who is 20, does not really look into her future with hope. And this is despite the fact that she's privileged enough to have access to one of the world's best universities. It's not Oxford, sorry, it's the other one. And that she has, I hope, probably a lot more than most other people in her generations to build upon. And yet, for her, the climate precarity, the financial precarity, the job precarity wears down on her. And I don't think she would believe in the social contract if I asked her today. Now, she's a scientist, luckily, and not a politician, but I think one of the reasons why she's not interested in politics is because she does not see that the social contract is working in her interest. She does see that science works in her interest, but not the system that we have in place today. And I think that's sad. So in order to build back that trust, what do we do? I think, Beinhocker says rightly, it is a long-term process and it's a hard process, but maybe it is true that it starts with bringing education back to everyone, bringing education back at maybe primary school level to enable people to grow, but also to enable people to see through the lies. I also very strongly believe that as politicians, we have to lower the barriers to entry for other politicians, that we have to mentor young people, notably people from minorities and women, to represent their peers, to represent people who look like them, who think like them. And that at the moment, there are lots of barriers. There are a lot of fears, there are a lot of deterrents to becoming politicians, particularly at local level, but also at parliamentary level. So I've been trying to mentor, for example, young people from migration backgrounds to become politicians. And trust me, it is not easy to motivate people at the moment because politicians are hated by many people and they're subject to the kind of abuse that you would never accept in the private sector. So that's another thing that I very strongly believe we need to change. I believe it at that because there clearly are many more experts in this room. And I would really very much welcome questions. I know that Professor Tucker has to leave at 4, so maybe we can start with questions specifically for him, if that's okay with you, but and obviously open it up to the debate for everyone after that.
Maybe first take a round.
People are exhausted.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for all contributors. I've really been touched by very valuable and high quality experiences, words and phrases. I don't have a question for Professor Tucker, but I will kindly ask him to respond to Julian's proposition that to not putting everything on the populist package, because I do not agree with him. And then I will ask my question as well, maybe add a few words, but because Professor Tucker leaving, maybe he will give us some, will say something about this if we say racism or I don't know, all these negative words for populists, they feel bad and it's not fair, etc. What would you say?
Well,
Thank you.
In one respect, it's actually even worse because I live on 2 continents, like a good quantum particle at the same time. My wife teaches at Harvard. We don't know a single person who at least admits that they voted for Donald Trump. None, nobody. That's the level of, that's how much in a bubble each one of us live. When we once passed in the street and there was some worker fixing something and on his truck there was some Trump sticker and kind of, look, well, finally we see somebody, but they were not from the neighborhood, obviously. They came to fix something. So in that respect, this discourse is perfectly safe. Nobody's going to get offended because they will never hear of it. That we are living in different bubbles. And then when the contact comes, it's through the algorithms. And then people, and then the point about Twitter is that you can't reason. There's no space for reasoning. You just express some emotion, some passion, and then you get the passion back, and then there's the mob, and that's the end of the discussion. So it really is much worse. Now, having said that, there is racism. The problem rather is that, at least, and I'll speak about the United States. I don't know to what extent this is true of Europe. in the United States, what I would call the populism of the left would be using such label to shut people up. And to just, not because they are racists or sexist or whatever, but because that's how you shut people up. You use that to morally humiliate them and to delegitimize them. Now, my problem, and I think the Lib Dem as well, I mean, I know Lucas, from The Economist, another Lib Dem, is that you fight in both fronts. You have to fight, because for the populists of the left and the right, the back is to the wall, so they fight in one direction. We have to fight on both sides, and we have to say, we don't believe in shutting people up, and we also don't like racism, and that's a difficult struggle to maintain, because you have to fight in both directions at the same time, and you can't, because with a level of extremism right now, the whole discourse, and that's how the algorithm also work. You say, I don't like somebody, and then they say, he's a really evil, vicious person, and then somebody else, we got to kill him, and then the more in the algorithm just getting and against that, there's a new book now by Aurelian from University of Indiana about moderation and the value of moderation, and that's something that, again, it is something that is entirely lost. The substance of this, of people who feel humiliated, is I think it's about blocked mobility, because I mean, I'm just, again, I will just use my own bubble. I don't know, but I haven't met anybody really who was mobile in a significant way in relation to their parents. Really none. I mean, there's some people, like what Harvard does is it picks up some people like who really were, father heroin addict, mother in prison, whatever. They pick up some of these people and then they arrange for their mobility. But that's really, it's a token. It's because they block the middle classes. So the upper class, they protect themselves, and then they bring, you call me, I'm extremely, look, I just brought, his father is in prison, his mother is a heroin addict, or I plucked him up from a refugee camp in somewhere. But it's a tiny minority, a vociferous minority, but a tiny minority. So that's the problem is I think in order to prevent people from humiliation, there has to be mobility. And that's where we failed now, certainly since the recession of 2008. Before that, I mean, what was stunning for me when I came to Prague, just the level of mobility after the revolution, just amazing. And, I mean, I have one aspect I share with my former neighbors in Long Island, and I enjoy a sense of humor. So, in 1993, I went with my mother-in-law to an exhibition in a gallery. Out from the pub next comes totally drunk, not a dwarf, but just a very small man. And she says, I remember you're Malipes, was in Czech, his little dog. It was his pet name. And she obviously does not enjoy the interaction. And he says, oh, you remember in the 1970s when I came back, I used to get drunk and live in your kitchen? I said, yeah, I remember. Okay. And then she said, so Yaka, I don't work in the circus anymore. And she said, oh yeah, what do you do? I'm the head of the Department of International Contracts in the Foreign Office. And that's, and that was the reality. And it was fascinating to see that and see how everything was moving. And now it's just also there. I mean, the Czechs have this populism with the human face. It's not so extreme, but it's still, it's there. And we need to find a way to just open the gates. I mean, the GI Bill would be a good example of how you generate social mobility. That's how Henry Kissinger got from nowhere to where he was. That's as an example. And that's why there's so much resentment against him. He got to where he didn't belong. But that's the sort of thing we need in education, in housing, and so
on. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. There's so many things to say about this. I would like to just start with a few, yeah, just with a few thoughts on that. So how does this, so words have a function, right? So what's the function of this word populist, right? So we use this, we have this word populist, then we load it, right? With all kinds of bad connotations, and then we have it in our hand, right? And then we look at people and say, if you say something wrong, right? If you criticize the wrong thing, then we stick it to you. And if you have this sticker on you, populist, then it means I don't need to take you seriously anymore. I don't need to talk to you anymore. You are a persona non grata, right? This is what Jan Werner Müller in his book, Populism, right? That is basically the mechanism that he describes, and he calls building a cordon sanitaire. Sorry, my French is very bad, right? But that's the mechanism behind the cordon sanitaire, right? So what is the effect of that? The effect of that is that we don't know anybody that votes for Trump, even though 50% of the people voted for Trump, yeah? So that means, first of all, this kind of effect, this kind of strategy, right? Building cordon sanitaires seems to be not very effective, right? Because what it leads to is that we prevent communication, but we don't change people's minds. And it just leads to people silently voting for these kind of people. And as they read about themselves in the media every day, right? That they are racist, that they are stupid, that they are irrational, they will feel humiliated, and they will vote for these kind of candidates even more, right? Because by humiliating them, we push them into that direction, right? To this right-wing direction, right? And that's just an empirical claim that I'm putting forward here. But it's an empirical claim that is very well validated, right? So I think, you know, I'm a huge fan of John Stuart Mill, right? And one of the fundamental ideas of John Stuart Mill is always to say, let's communicate about issues. Let's not put stickers on people. Just let's stick to the topics and let's see what we can do better, right? If we have a schooling problem, let's see how we can solve the schooling problem. If we have an income problem, let's look at how we can solve the income problem, yeah? I will just, because everybody, you know, talked about like personal stories. When I grew up in Hamburg, yeah, I was living in an okay neighborhood, yeah, but whenever I went to the soccer, when I want to play soccer, right, that was quite a dangerous thing, right? And it was quite a dangerous thing because of the area where I lived, right? And even though, and so what I just want to say, a lot of problems are local, right? It's just, and these local problems then also need to be solved locally. And I just think, you know, we as academics can do very little, I feel, right? I mean, I think politicians can do much more, but I think what we can do is really think about whether the language that we use, right, whether that in total has a positive effect, whether it opens channels for communications or whether it disrupts channels of communications. And in the end, it's an empirical question. But I think the data is in, right? We tried to use this cordon sanitaire strategy now for I don't know, 10, 15 years. And when I look at the data, I see right-wing parties only getting stronger. So maybe we should change our strategy. Thank you very much.
Let me make one or two brief comments. I think it's very important for us to live in the world that exists rather than the one we wish existed, and to engage with the humanity that exists rather than the humanity that we wish existed. And very often when people use the word populist, as you rightly said, it's basically used as a term of abuse. It doesn't tell you anything at all. And I think it's quite dangerous to express the proposition that the people are voting the wrong way because they've been manipulated by other people. Because what that is fundamentally saying is we can't actually trust people to cast their vote. And that fundamentally undermines the whole notion of democracy. Now, it may well be that the notion of democracy is a false prospectus. It may well be. But then we have to work through to the consequences of that. If that is the case, then what does that mean about what's the alternative way of running society? What's the, in particular, what is the way of changing governments without violence? There has come to be a view, and I have to say it's a widely held view amongst our Liberal colleagues, that the whole point of elections is to represent people. It's not. The whole point of elections is that it's the only way that we have found of changing governments without revolutionary violence. And the governments don't represent the people because the people are divided. The people do not have a single view. And I remember, for example, when John Hume was talking, I use the Irish context because it's a bit different from the context most of you are used to living in. And that's why I bring it forward. And also because it's a context where we tried some things that didn't work and we tried some things that did work. One of the things John Hume asked the IRA, he said to them, what do you want? And they said, we want a united Ireland. And he said, well, look at the map. It is one island. It's always been one island. And they said, yeah, but there's a border. And they said, yes, what that tells you is that the people of Ireland can't agree how to share the island. And they said, no, but it's the Brits. He says, okay, I'll go and talk to the Brits. And if the Brits come out and say, you can do whatever you like with the place, basically, as long as it's peaceful. We don't have any agenda anymore. Oh, they'll never say that. Well, they did. The British government came out and said, we no longer have any selfish strategic or economic interest. In other words, please take it out into the middle of the Atlantic. It's only a problem to us. But that didn't solve the problem. Why? Because the people were not of a single mind. And one of the problems that I had about the title for this conference, about we the people, within that there is a kind of assumption that the people are of a mind. You say, oh, no, but it's, you know, the working class people are of a mind. No, they're not of one mind. They're not of one mind at all. People differ very radically in the way that they think about it. It's just not all based on economic questions. If you deal with people who are involved in terrorism, for example, you very quickly find that these people are prepared to do things that are wholly damaging to themselves and their economic welfare and so on. So when you understand that, you understand that the economic driver is not the only driver. And for many people, it's not even the most important driver. There are other things. People will go and they will die for a flag. They will die for their country. Whenever people get involved in physical force and violence, mostly it's not because of what they're being paid. And very often you get these superficial nonsense talked about, oh, well, these guys are going off to be suicide bombers and so on because they get paid for it. This is nonsense. That's not the driver for it at all. And all it does is deceive ourselves. And then we come up with the wrong answers to these kinds of things. So it's a very much more complex, difficult problem than is often made out. And the difficulty is often that when we think up our theories, and we then apply them to the real world, we find they don't work. And then we get really angry with people because they won't behave according to the way our theories tell them they ought to be behaving. And what one has got to do is to try to listen to what people say and realize it does not conform to most of the socioeconomic theories. And understand people do differ profoundly, and they will always differ profoundly. And it doesn't matter how much education you give to people, they won't all agree. That's the problem. Very often people say more education because they think if everybody gets educated, they'll agree with each other. Well, you just need to come to a university to know that the fact that people have been educated doesn't mean that they agree with each other. In fact, they spend most of their time trying to prove that they were right. We often say about doctors, you make the diagnosis in the first 20 minutes and spend the next 25 years trying to prove your diagnosis was right. It's a very difficult thing to actually be open to the fact that it's a very complex challenging world out there to which there is no one answer that actually explains things. And so your comment, for example, about complexity essentially is really important, because there is a complex world out there and we don't know the answers to it.
Well, I would never dare to disagree with my fellow Liberal Democrat, John, of course, except
Liberals
that-
disagree
except-
all the time, for
except
goodness
I
sake.
hadn't
Party
finished.
known for collective
finished,
thinking. Yes.
Except on one point. And that is, yes, of course, yes, of course, the whole point is that you do have a debate, and you do treat respectfully people who you disagree with. However, I would make the point that at an age of the kind of disinformation that it makes it really, really hard to discern truth from fake, deep fakes, etc. The task of making an informed decision has become difficult even for experts, let alone for other people. And in this case, the question is whether, yes, you respect people's opinion, but if this opinion is guided by the kind of brainwash that we have now in place, not just in, Russia and the likes, but also amidst in our democratic Western societies, the question is, whether or not that suffices in order to have a legitimate.
But here's where you need to be
function.
careful, because there's an assumption in what you're saying that the rest of them out there are affected, but my thinking is not so affected by all of these things. And that's not the case.
We all live in bubbles.
Exactly. And that's the point that
Absolutely.
you were making.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Thank you. Other questions, please? Thank you very much, Professor Tucker. Safe travels. We have time for one or two more questions. I think I saw your hand first. Go ahead.
That was quick. Thank you very much. I loved your talks and you gave me much food for thought. Thank you very much for that. I would like to ask those of you who thought that one shouldn't denigrate people and shouldn't aggress the populists because that's a bad word. How would you call Trump? That's my first question. What qualifier would you pick for him? Would you just say that he's a Republican? So that would be one question, and the one that follows up is, are you sure that well, denigrating, humiliating, aggressing people is perhaps exactly the version that is too strong to be not agreeing with you, but showing people that they make mistakes, arguing their points of views, saying that Brexit was a mistake, saying that voting for Trump and having Trump in office for a second time was a mistake. Isn't that part of political discourse? Isn't that the way how we negotiate our values as a society, our political preferences as a society? Am I supposed to create a safe space for every individual voter to vote whatever he thinks, and which will have repercussions on my life as well? Am I not entitled to telling him that that's garbage? I mean, no, frankly, I see you all in such an empathetic way of talking about voters who make decisions that I, at least, disapprove of. And I think that for a politician, that's probably a wise attitude to adopt, because you cannot afford to denigrate any potential voter. But for those who come from a more academic background, I think there is also another argument to be made, which is this negotiating aspect, and even shunning people for their points of view, putting labels on their philosophies and their preferences, in my view, is part of, well, it's a negative signal, but it is a negative signal through which societies rein in certain developments sometimes. And there may be thresholds beyond which the reining in doesn't work anymore because the group has grown too large. But I'm not sure it's an entirely bad and ill-reasoned thing to do, to pinpoint to people and saying, you've voted for a future dictator, so you're complicit.
I think there are two or three things. First of all, in terms of what kind of label would I put on Trump, a label is only useful if it actually conveys something meaningful. And Trump is clearly not a traditional Republican. Actually, the first time I saw Trump, I immediately thought to myself, I've seen this exactly before. He's exactly like Ian Paisley, except he's got more money and more women. But apart from that, his behavior is exactly the same as I'd seen before. So it is a particular kind of approach, or personality, or whatever. And there are interesting similarities about the background. So I think I don't have a problem about applying certain kinds of labels. You know, we've talked about political labels and whether you hold to them or not. But you have to be a little bit careful that the labels actually fit and apply. And I'm not sure that Trump is particularly susceptible to the kind of Democrat Republican kind of label that you're describing. Second thing is, of course, it's hugely important to be able to disagree. That's not the issue. But when you started off what you were saying, you were talking about disagreement. When you got later on, you started talking about rubbish and you're responsible for horrible things happening and so on and so on. And that's more than disagreeing. That's a different kind of phenomenon. One of my friends who's a little older now, but still quite thoughtful and active, wrote a book recently, he's a psychoanalyst, and he wrote a book recently applying his understanding to society in general. And psychoanalysts tend to talk at considerable length about most things, as you can imagine. And to tease him, I said, well, Ed, can you sum up the book in a sentence? Tell me what it is you learned. He says, yes, I can. So I was a little bit surprised. I said, okay, what's the sentence? He says, it's this. When I meet someone with whom I disagree profoundly, I have to ask myself the question, what are they right about? Because if they believe something, there is something there. Doesn't mean that it's factually correct. That's another issue. But there's something in there that is saying something right for them, right about them. And that's actually a really important discipline, I think. So indeed, whenever you listen to Donald Trump and you feel really angry and frustrated, it's perfectly reasonable feelings to have. But then it's important to ask yourself the question, why half the population voted for him? And not to pretend, as a lot of Democrats do, that, oh, well, it was really close. And, you know, if there'd been a little bit of this and it was the fault of the Electoral College and all that, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether it was a few percentage points this way or that. The question is, why did it happen? And it happened actually because the Democrats had in many ways failed their job. And I remember the time when I thought, this is really dangerous. It was Obama, who I like a lot. I have a lot of time for him. Very bright, thoughtful man. But he was speaking at the annual press luncheon, White House press luncheon. You will remember it. And he was joking, as you know, the president does. It's part of the whole kind of thing. And Trump was there. And he took quite a deal of time to make fun of Trump. And the camera focused in on Trump. And I thought, I like you a lot. You're a very nice guy. But this is not only foolish, this man is going to spend the rest of his life taking to pieces anything that you have done. And so that's why I think one has to be very careful. It's not about disagreeing. It's not about joking and so on. But that wasn't just about joking. It was actually profoundly humiliating of this man. Whether it's right or wrong wasn't the point. So I think that's where one has, you're absolutely right. It's important that we can disagree, but it's about disagreeing well and also saying to oneself, and you are right about something and I have to take it seriously. I don't have to agree with it, but I have to take it seriously and try to think about it and understand it. And I think that's difficult because these things are not commensurable.
Thank you. Professor Miller, would you add to that? Like to add to this?
I would like to add something to it. I think, first of all, it's a great challenge, Karen. It's a great challenge. I mean, I think Trump, I would call it demagogue, right? Demagoge in German, however you pronounce it in English. And I would, yeah, make the same point as John, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, you know, you made a mistake, and it's another thing to say that, to make like an argument that is essentially a false consciousness argument, right? To say that, you know, you are unreliable in picking up information. You are basically irrational. And I mean, one of the things, and I will just add this here because we're at an academic conference, it's not quite clear actually whether, I mean, there's a huge literature on whether people are really susceptible to fake news. And that literature says people are actually not as susceptible to fake news as we think. There's a huge literature that looks at how, you know, widespread filter bubbles are. Not that widespread. There's a huge literature that tries to measure in how far, you know, I talked about that earlier, in how far things like Cambridge Analytica actually made a difference. Actually didn't, right? So we have this narrative that all of these people are idiots and are misled and cannot trust, you know, their rational judgment. And this is what, when we say all of these things, are we not dehumanizing them? I have no problem with dehumanizing Trump, right? Not for a minute, right? He's a demagogue. I'm just thinking about the voters, right? And I'm thinking about all these like 50% of our fellow men who voted for them, right? And I think we need to be very, you know, yeah, we need to find like a better strategy than name calling, basically. And how that works, how this is best done, Karen, you might know better than I do, right? You are a brilliant journalist, and I'm only a philosopher writing for academics. So maybe you tell me.
Thank you. If I can get back to Beinhocker for a moment. I do believe that the surge in populism we see is a backlash against liberal democracy. And I do think it has to do with arrogance. And yes, of course, you're right in thinking that Brexit was a completely irrational, idiotic thing from a rational perspective and from an educated person's perspective, but it did happen. And the more we try to lecture, the more we feed that backlash, in my view. Look at Emmanuel Macron, who is a big hero of mine. He's a highly intelligent man. I agree with most of his policies, right? I think makes total sense. It's very rational for me, at least as a liberal Democrat. And yet he's hated even by, you know, fellow liberal-minded people because he's speaking down at people, because he's perceived as being arrogant. And that is his downfall. And the truth is that is the downfall of many so-called progressive liberal politicians. It is the way that we, and I unfortunately need to include myself and fellow politicians and the progressive side in Britain, that we talk to people trying to lecture them. It doesn't go down well. It is one of the 9 dimensions Beinhocker mentions that has to do with respect and with dignity, even if we disagree. And yes, of course we disagree. I think we try to convince, but if we don't listen, if we label somebody as racist before they have even started saying what they meant to say about immigration, which may be, you know, have some rational basis, then we lose them. And we can't afford to lose them because we live in a democracy and their vote counts just as much as the vote of you and I and somebody educated at Oxford. So that is democracy. We officially have to finish in a few minutes, and I'm supposed to give a closing remark. However, I do think that your questions and your contributions are more important. So I would love to have maybe one last question before I try to do a very, very short summary and closing. Anybody else? Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this brilliant panel. I actually agree with you that, you know, populism is a leadership style, and everyone gets the information from their constituency, but what you do with that is very important. Whether you can aggravate and exaggerate the basic kind of confrontation which has there. And I think that's or you can open the new perspective. You can suggest other perspectives to the issue. And I think that's the sort of enlightened leadership of what we call transformative leadership, when you open other perspective on the issue rather than aggravate the message, what the populists do. My other issue is I wanted to actually support what you told about the respect. It's a short story. I was taken to the Gloucester Green station by the taxi, and the very short period of time, I found out that he's from Tanzania. He's an Arab from Tanzania. And I asked him, I said, you know, I'm writing an article about liberal democracy. I'm very interested. Do you think that people of Tanzania, they share the liberal values? We came to he didn't answer. But then when we came to the Gloucester Green and I gave him £6, he said, no, I'll take you to the airport. I said, I don't have so much money. He said, I'm not charging you. I'm taking you for free, only for one question. That do you think that people of Tanzania share liberal values? And that's the best support for your idea of respect. He was ready to sacrifice the sort of earning to the airport and back, which is almost 200 pounds, only because we just showed this sort of sign of respect to his personality. And we had all the way, we had discussion about people of Tanzania and liberal values. So that's, I think, a perfect confirmation of what you said. And the major conclusion of our conference that I think should be that empowerment of ordinary people is probably the best way to resolve the issues we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a really nice story. Would either of you like to comment?
No, just beautiful story. Beautiful.
Yes. Indeed. And I think this is such a happy note on which to close this conference, but I can't close it without giving a huge applause and huge thanks to Simiye, who has organized everything, which must have been a huge amount of work, has rallied everybody around. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Liz. And I'm also very, very proud to be part of the European Centre for Populism Studies, which I have to say has not only organized these fantastic events, but has personally enriched my life, has given me a lot of food for thought, and has given me what is so important, which is hope that we all work in the right direction. We all work together collaboratively, as we have learned from Beinhocker. We should go ahead. So thank you also to Selçuk and to Azize and others who have made this possible. And I wish you a safe trip home wherever you came from, and hope to see you at the next event. Thank you.